Hello, this is the first video in a series where I summarize and explain a book by Catherine Cornille titled Meaning and Method in Comparative Theology. In this video, we will start with the introduction. But before delving into the book, I want to explain what comparative theology is. To do that, let's briefly differentiate first between three similar disciplines: theology, religious studies, and the philosophy of religion. First, theology. Theology is usually defined as the study of religion from within a particular religious tradition. It starts from faith or from the beliefs and practices of a specific community and tries to understand them more deeply. Second, religious studies. Religious studies is also the study of religion, but it aims to be objective and detached from any one tradition. Here, religion is treated mainly as a human and historical phenomenon, using tools from history, sociology, anthropology, and so on. Third, the philosophy of religion. The philosophy of religion studies religion, again, in a supposedly objective or neutral way, but it focuses more on ideas and arguments. It looks at religious beliefs as claims that can be analyzed and evaluated rationally. These definitions are not perfect, they are simply simple working definitions for the series, my best attempt to roughly distinguish these disciplines. Now, there is also something called comparative religion or comparative religious studies. This field compares similarities and differences between religions, again with the goal of being neutral and academic. With this in mind, we can now understand what comparative theology is. Comparative theology is still theology. It is the study of religion from within a particular religious tradition. But it is a kind of theology that seriously studies other religious traditions as well and learns from them in order to gain new insights and to deepen the understanding of one's own tradition. Now we can start with the introduction by Cornille. Cornille says that throughout history, religions have developed their beliefs and practices through a conscious or unconscious process of borrowing, refuting, and reinterpreting elements from other religious traditions. As such, in a way, comparative theology always existed and always formed an integral part of every theological tradition. However, in a strict sense, the modern discipline of comparative theology is something new due to its conscious, open, and systematic engagement with other religions in the process of theological development, including the genuine granting of credit to other religious traditions and the acknowledgement of them as possible repositories of constructive theological insight and inspiration, all within an attitude of humility and generosity toward the religious other. Thus, comparative theology could be said to be a synthesis of religious studies and theology, as it draws from the methods of both disciplines. From the history and the comparative study of religions, it has inherited not only a vast amount of scholarly material, but also an understanding of the complexity and diversity of religious traditions and of the need to focus on particular texts, teachings, or practices. In other words, we can't just compare Islam and Christianity. We have to focus more on particular scholars or particular texts and compare them. Even though comparative theology benefits a lot from religious studies, comparative theology is still theology, so it is an explicitly normative discipline. It seeks ultimate reality or truth. It doesn't just compare. Having said that, comparative theology is still different from pure theology, since comparative theology involves the comparison of religions for the purpose of advancing theological understanding. It is important to note here that theology literally means the study of God, and it is usually understood to be the study of religious beliefs. But in a wider sense, theology can be applied to rituals, ethics, and institutional and artistic forms. So, similarly, comparative theology may be applied to rituals, ethics, and institutional and artistic forms. Now, how do you define comparative theology? Comparative theology has taken different forms as its practitioners have developed different conceptions of the nature and goal of the discipline, and this is reflected in the various definitions of comparative theology. While some emphasize the tradition based or confessional origin and goal of comparative theology, others present it as a trans religious or meta-confessional discipline. To simplify, being confessional could mean that one is committed to a certain tradition and works from within it. Like being a Catholic, one would try to learn from other religions while being committed to the traditional teachings of the Catholic Church. While being meta-confessional would mean not being committed to a certain tradition but trying to arrive at a universal truth across different traditions. In other words, one could say that one is traditional while the other is non denominational in a sense. So, again, while some emphasize the tradition based or confessional origin and goal of comparative theology, others present comparative theology as a trans-religious or meta-confessional discipline. Now, let's check out several definitions, starting with David Tracy, who defines comparative theology as any explicitly intellectual interpretation of a religious tradition that affords a central place to the fact of religious pluralism in the tradition's self-interpretation. Let me say it again a couple of times so that you could try to understand it. Comparative theology is any explicitly intellectual interpretation of a religious tradition. So explicitly, so conscious, intellectual, not artistic or other forms. Interpretation of a religious tradition, so not just Christianity, for example, any religious tradition. that affords a central place, meaning allows or gives a central place to the fact or reality of religious pluralism or plurality in the traditions that we are interpreting, in the tradition's self-interpretation. In other words, again, it is the explicit intellectual interpretation of one's own religious tradition that makes the reality of other religions a central factor in its interpretation. So, for example, as a Zaidi, for instance, a Zaidi Shiite Muslim, trying to interpret Zaydism, if the Zaidi keeps in mind or gives great importance to the existence of the other traditions within Islam and even other traditions within other religions, this person is doing comparative theology. Now, then Cornille gives a very slight critique of this definition, saying that this definition is so broad that theological reflection on the reality of other religions, what is usually called theology of religions, now counts as comparative theology rather than remaining a clearly distinct field. There is a discipline called theology of religions, which tries to understand from your own tradition why there is other religions, why is there a difference, and how do we deal with it, and so on. So what's the difference between comparative theology and the theology of religions? According to the definition of David Tracy, there is a problem here. Now, another definition by Francis Clooney focuses more specifically on the actual process of comparison. So, Clooney defines comparative theology as acts of faith seeking understanding which are rooted in a particular faith tradition. In other words, theology. But a theology which, from that foundation or tradition, venture into learning from one or more other faith traditions. This learning is done for the sake of fresh theological insights that are indebted to the newly encountered tradition or traditions, as well as the home tradition. End quote. This classical definition emphasizes the confessional nature of comparative theology, while pointing to the possibility for theological change and growth through learning from other religious traditions. Now, a third definition. The constructive dimension, says Cornille, is also in evidence in James Fredericks's definition of comparative theology as not only a revisionist but also a constructive project in which theologians interpret the meaning and truth of one tradition by making critical correlations with the classics of another religious tradition. To understand what construction and revision are, we need to go on a tangent. Change can affect content and or form. Content refers to claims, meanings, or doctrines, while form refers to the linguistic expressions of these doctrines and the supporting arguments. So, we could define revision as removing some content, while construction can be defined as adding a lot of new content and or new form. So, if we abandon a bit of doctrine, or a lot of doctrines, that would be just revision. A small reinterpretation of a certain form, like keeping the form and changing the content, that would also be just a revision. Because we removed some content, but it wouldn't be construction because we didn't add enough content. A big reformulation, like keeping the content but just changing the form, that would be construction. Likewise, a big introduction, like adding new content and form, that would only be construction, not revision. There is, however, big reinterpretation. That would be both revision and construction, where reinterpretation, again, is keeping the form but changing the content. In this sense, let's read again the definition of James Fredericks, which says comparative theology is not only a revisionist, it doesn't just remove content, it is also a constructive project. It adds new content and or form, in which theologians interpret in it the meaning and truth of one tradition, such as Catholicism, by making critical correlations or comparisons. Critical here meaning a correlation or comparison that doesn't depend on authority. So correlations with the classics or texts of another religious tradition. Now, others define comparative theology while seeking to move beyond the boundaries of any particular religion. For example, John Tatamanael describes comparative theology as engaging specific texts, motifs, and claims of particular traditions, not only to understand better these traditions, but also to determine the truth of theological matters through conversation and collaboration. End quote. So, whereas confessional comparative theologians might seek to elucidate the truth of their own traditions, religious truth is he considered more open-ended, to be determined in the process of comparative theological engagement. And with that, we reach the end of the video, and thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.